Hello everyone, I'm Jack, the Rambling Raconteur, and we're on our journey to Old Mars. And you're wondering, what the heck is Old Mars? So when I use that phrase, what I refer to is the science fiction and, I don't know, sometimes like the fantasy, written about the planet Mars and like alien life on Mars, Martian empires, in the period before we actually sent probes to land on Mars and realized like it's way too cold for complex sentient life forms, that we think of like as Martian aliens to live there, that the great long canals that we saw, from distance through telescopes were actually just, like rivulets, possible, fissures in the earth. They weren't created by life, like dug by life. And I say that as someone who lives about a mile-ish south, north, it's to a mile south, is one of the old Hohokam canals here in Phoenix that when farmers who wanted to irrigate the land just basically redug the canals the Hohokam had dug to irrigate their land, their crops, and their fruit trees and stuff here in Phoenix. And it was while they were digging a canal that's about a mile south of my house that they decided in a drunken bonfire party to name this little settlement Phoenix. So the idea of Martian canals has always fascinated me as someone who lives, in an area where there are canals for irrigation. The Phoenix gets its drinking water from the Central Arizona Project, a thin canal that runs all the way from the Colorado River across the state to here. So anyways, Old Mars has this idea that there were once these grand civilizations. They're somewhat esoteric or remote, almost Egyptian or with some of the strange aspects of like ancient Byzantium, creating these great civilizations. And then we sent probes there and realized like there's certainly there's no ruins of lost civilizations on Mars that we can find. It's a dead planet. And Roger Zelazny's A Rose for Ecclesiastes is one of the greatest Old Mars stories. It's a fascinating story, and it posits a third expedition to Mars, a third human expedition to Mars from Earth. And there is this tiny conclave, and I use that term intentionally, of Martians that are still extant on the planet. And they all seem to live within this one temple, that's like subterranean almost, and then within a mountain. And that's it. That's all that's left of the civilization. They can go, they see ruins of a lost civilization. They find out later on that these Martians live for hundreds of years, at least. Like a young Martian woman is 240 years old or so, which suggests maybe they live to be 1,000 years. They joke about one of the characters being as old as Methuselah, which would be, I think, 969 years or something. So there's a character who manages to gain access to this Martian temple, and he's a poet who has a natural affinity for languages, and this character Gallinger is the one who gets access to the last few remnants of this Martian civilization, and he's going to learn about their culture, learn about their history, learn their language. It turns out there's a high and low form of the language. And he's gonna try and translate and copy out as many of their texts as possible, photograph as many of their texts as possible, learn about their culture, and that's gonna be it, because it seems like their civilization is just dying off. And then of course there's a twist to it. But I want to give you an example of some of the language in here. Zelazny can be a really fun writer and a really interesting writer with the influences that he brings in, and I'm gonna point that out with a couple of these stories. So here he goes. He's talking about Mars. He goes, "I came to the land where the sun is a tarnished penny, where the wind is a whip, where two moons play at hot rod games, and a hell of sand gives you the incendiary itches whenever you look at it." And he's very descriptive about how the Martian desert is different from the Gobi Desert or the Great Southwestern Desert. How there's nothing growing out there. There aren't even cacti pushing up. One of the characters on the expedition is trying to grow some cacti, in the botanical garden behind their compound. And he's reading their texts. He goes, "They wrote about concrete things, the Martians. Rock, sand, water, winds, and the tenor couched within these elemental symbols was fiercely pessimistic. It reminded me of some Buddhist texts, but even more so, I realized from my recent recherches, it was like parts of the Old Testament. Specifically, it reminded me of the Book of Ecclesiastes. That, then, would be it." And he's talking about how to translate this. as well as the vocabulary was so similar, the sentiment as well as the vocabulary was so similar that it would be a perfect exercise, like putting Poe into French. I would never be a convert to the way of Milan, but I would show them that an earthman had once thought the same thoughts, felt similarly. I switched on my desk lamp and sought King James amidst my books. And so he uses his way into their culture is the Book of Ecclesiastes, the famous, vanity passage. And I'll read that at the end of this for those who are interested. But as he gets access, he encounters a young Martian woman who's actually like 240 years old. And she comes out and dances before him. And what we discover is that this science fiction story is really... it's an elegy for this lost culture, this culture that's dying, that seems to be incapable of reproduction. It's notable that for many pages in this story, the only Martians we see are a sort of almost like a Mother Superior type individual, this older Martian woman who's sort of in charge of the temple, it seems, the younger woman who's a dancer, and then a pair of musicians. Like, that really seems to be it. We don't see many people, individuals, Martians within this culture. And so here's Zelazny's description of the dance. She began a microscopic swaying, a fraction of an inch right, then left. Her fingers opened like the petals of a flower, and I could see that her eyes were closed. Her eyes opened. They were distant, glassy, looking through me and the walls. Her swaying became pronounced, merged with the beat. The wind was sweeping in from the desert now, falling against Tyrrhenian like waves on a dike. Her fingers moved. They were the gusts. Her arms, slow pendulums, descended, began a counter-movement. The gale was coming now. She began an axial movement, and her hands caught up with the rest of her body. Only now her shoulders commenced to ride out a figure eight. The wind, I say. Oh, wild, enigmatic. Oh, muse of St. John Perse. The cyclone was twisting around those eyes, its still center. Her head was thrown back, but I knew there was no ceiling between her gaze, passive as Buddha's, and the unchanging skies. Only the two moons, perhaps, interrupted their slumber in that elemental nirvana of uninhabited turquoise. And so we just get this picture of an individual basically dancing, and her dance evokes the entire Martian landscape and the weather systems that exist there. And it's this really beautiful passage. And so gradually, Gallinger gets to know this character. He stays that he's basically camped out at the temple in order to translate as many texts as possible and take like camera, photographs of them. Talks about microfilm, which feels very 1960s, 1950s like sci-fi. And then of course there's this twist within it. This idea of like cultures in conflict, and there's never any sense of war. There's a little bit of violence, but no sense of war. But this idea of cultures in conflict and cultures being capable of empowering each other, but also the need to respect other cultures, the need ultimately to be able to say, like, you have this culture and it is healthy for you, and it might not be what I choose, but it is healthy for you, and a need to question but ultimately value, the judgments other individuals make. So it's a wonderful story. It's a great, great old Mars story. It evokes that sense of, I was thinking of Bradbury's Martian Chronicles. Like, it evokes that sense of the Martian Chronicles, where you have just this lost civilization that's in its final throes, and we're going to see something fascinating. And so, and with the emphasis on Ecclesiastes, I kind of thought of this as like a Midrash on Mars, Midrash meets Mars mashup, and it's been going through my mind this week. That story, so the story was collected in this collection, The Doors of His Face, The Lamps of His Mouth, which is, the title story is an old Venus story. We have about a massive Leviathan-like creature that they're trying to hunt. It's sort of like Moby Dick is a short story on Venus. Excellent. But it was also collected in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, Volume 1, a collection of short stories, like 25-ish short stories that are excellent. This one has Nightfall. And Zelazny repeatedly does reference human religious thought in his texts. Lord of Light is a really big one that delves into, I believe it's, the Hindu pantheon. And it's sort of like a science fiction story that's very much set within, it's very informed by Hindu belief. Another great book. And then if you really like those old Mars stories, the other text I would recommend is This short story collection, I know it says George R. R. Martin on there, but it's nothing like Game of Thrones. It's an anthology that he helped edit. Gardner Dozois does most of the editing, I think. And it has a number of solid, like, old Mars stories. Michael Moorcock pops up in here. And they're all newer stories from, I would say, maybe like 2005-ish, 2010. So, great ones. And now, to close out, I'm going to do 2 readings. So, at this point, if you don't want to listen to any of the readings, you can just end the video. But one of the things Zelazny does, he imbues this poet character Gallagher with a number of different poetic sensibilities. He talks about Wallace Stevens. They keeps referring to west winds, hint, hint, Percy Shelley. But he also has the character translate from German into like English into Martian. Rainer Maria Rilke's Spanish Dancer. So I thought I'd read that. So it's about a dancer. As on all its sides, a kitchen match darts white, flickering tongues before it bursts into flame. With the audience around her, quickened, hot, her dance begins to flicker in the dark room. And all at once, it is completely fire. One upward glance, and she ignites her hair, and whirling faster and faster, fans her dress into passionate flames, till it becomes a furnace, from which, like startled rattlesnakes, the long, naked arms uncoil, aroused and clicking. And then, as if the fire were too tight around her body, she takes and flings it out, haughtily, with an imperious gesture, and watches. It lies raging on the floor, still blazing up, and the flames refuse to die, till moving with total confidence and a sweet, exultant smile, she looks up finally and stamps it out with powerful small feet. And there's something that does get stamped out within A Rose for Ecclesiastes, is all I'll say about that. And then the last one I'll do is, I couldn't help it, with A Rose for Ecclesiastes, a great deal of the text hinges on the fact that Gallagher can go and quote Ecclesiastes to the Martians to help them gain some perspective on a decision that, as a small, very tiny remnant of a culture, they have to make. And so this is how he starts it. The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What profit hath a man of all his labor, which he taketh under the sun? One generation passeth away, and another generation cometh, but the earth abideth forever. The sun also ariseth, and the sun goeth down, and hasteth to his place where he arose. The wind goeth toward the south, and turneth about unto the north. It whirleth about continually, and the wind returneth again according to his circuits. All the rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full. Unto the place from whence the rivers come, thither they return again. All things are full of labor. Man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. The thing that hath been, it is that which shall be, and that which is done is that which shall be done, and there is no new thing under the sun. And that is just, that becomes the whole crux of the story. Is there anything new for a culture that has existed for millennia, for individuals that can live for 1,000 years, or a young person 250 years? How do we make life new? And for me, I think it's that idea is what I appreciate about life. It's why I value life so much, and the lives of those around me, is the continual opportunity to constantly be thinking through new ideas, interacting with new individuals, growing and learning, and growing even in hard times or hard landscapes. So that's A Rose for Ecclesiastes by Roger Zelazny, and Spanish Dancer by Rainer Maria Rilke. First couple verses from Ecclesiastes, and there you go. Have a good weekend, everyone. Thank you.